All right, we're recording. Welcome to the second session of Field Notes presented by the Flight Ready Systems, also with Analog Astronaut. Welcome to the session. We're happy to have everyone here. This is our second of many sessions. I'd like to say hello to all the Embry-Riddle students, all my students that are joining us either now or through the recording as well. Lots of friends and family that are kind of popping into the room as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into the topic. So let me share my PowerPoint. There we go. I'm just going to move the video out of the way. So hopefully I'm nice and clear and everything. And one of my co-hosts can jump in if a question comes up or something's wrong with my connection, because right now I only see the PowerPoint. But so welcome to the Analog Astronaut Field Notes series. Just a quick disclaimer that we're just here to provide insight. This is really just us sharing stories and some of our reflections from our experience. We're not trying to provide physical, psychological diagnosis, and we're not trying to, offer therapy. And we just hope that you enjoy these presentations and that you find them interesting. So session 2, living in sim. So as you'll see in a second, sim is for simulation. We're gonna be talking about the countermeasures that help with living in isolation, and this is based off of both spaceflight and analog missions. My name is Ryan Kobrick. I'm a professor at Embry-Riddle. I'm the principal investigator of the Spacesuit Utilization of Innovative Technology Laboratory, or SUIT Lab, and I'm also the CTO of Flight Ready Systems. So let's jump right into the kind of exploration side of things. This graphic was actually created a while ago by NASA when they were using language like Moon, Mars, and beyond. And so obviously the planets are not that's not to scale, and they're not that close to each other. But the idea here is that what we're looking at is that there's actually a lot of steps in between that need to be done in order to go from, I guess you could say, destination to destination. And so what I want to kind of cover is what exactly is a space analog. And I just kind of wanted to double disclaimer here that analog is actually spelt in 2 different ways. It's accepted by a lot of different communities. The without the UE is usually the US spelling, and with the UE is kind of the international spelling. So I'm just representing both communities with having both words up here. So we've got a location similar to one or more aspect of actually spaceflight that's preparing us for exploration. The key features would include the environment. So there's a list there, but things like temperature, remoteness, the actual topography, the mineralogy of things you would find. In even reduced microgravity can be an analog depending on where you are. So underwater, in space, those are actually analogs for other missions. So it's kind of funny to think about, but even astronauts on the space station, they spend 6 months in weightlessness, and that is an analog to the duration of a flight to Mars or the way back from Mars. And so they're actually learning about how the human body adapts over the amount of time it would take to get there. And then also the mission or task is what's key really for this talk, is that the in simulation aspect of it, where you actually lock up a crew, if you will, and send them to or a remote destination. And that aspect is them actually being part of a simulation. The other side is serendipitous. So you could take a submarine crew, look at data from how they lived in a high pressure environment or a pressurized environment as well, but underwater, very stressful, dependent on their life support systems, and it's also analogous to spaceflight. So there's a lot of places that you can go in the world, and I've been to a few, and I've been involved with a few others in terms of research collaboration. So this is the Mars Desert Research Station. It has a lot of similarities, and so in order to have a Mars analog, you really need to have a place that matches some of these variables. And so the goal overall for any analog is to match as many variables as possible. The analog research has a lot of different advantages, testing at a fraction of the cost because you're not obviously launching into space. There's a proving ground, so you can test technology. You can look at crew composition, look at all the different permutations of people living together, different disciplines, different age, different sex, different backgrounds, all the different cultural aspects that you can think of. you can develop field protocols, operations, get them, working smoothly before you go out and do things. One of the main things that we worked on a lot of these analogs is sample acquisition and how to properly document it so that we're well trained and know how to do that when we're in the field. And comparative planetology is kind of the key for the science investigations that happen in the field, because everything that we do out, I guess you can say, in an Earth environment are things that would relate to where we go in terms of exploring places like the Moon or Mars, and we'll get to that as well. The images here show you Apollo 17 and Nemo 13. Nemo is the simulated mission at Aquarius Reef Base, where NASA and other partners will train their astronauts. And so in this example, they're actually testing center of gravity for a spacesuit. So it looks awesome, thumbs up. So what's the problem with all these analogs, or what can go wrong? Well, it's an isolated and confined environment. And so what that means is that has a lot of potential hardships. You're isolated and separated from family. You're confined, so you're not locked up, but you're in a situation where if you go outside, you have to wear a spacesuit. There's possible sleep loss that you might go through just from stress of work or other things that could go wrong. Some of them are very dangerous environments, so you have to be aware of your surroundings and what needs to be done for those different missions. There's also the risk of the split between underwork, overwork, and being dissatisfied with your work. So if you're not satisfied with what you're doing, then of course that'll affect your ability to, I guess you can say, finish the job. The bottom example there shows the space station daily calendar. It's pretty intense. It's packed. They have slots when they're supposed to eat, sleep, and everything else. And so we do want to make sure that we have a firm schedule that we're working with for astronauts in future exploration, especially long duration missions. But we have to be aware that their personal time, downtime, and all that also have to be factored in. And so this is just a kind of a quick slide of examples of issues, if you will, that are relevant to spaceflight from the history of everything we've learned. There's some examples in the table there. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but I just wanted to kind of point out that there can be interpersonal conflicts. So that's person to person, or a person to like a control center or a remote science team. So that has been known as the us versus them syndrome. There's depression, anxiety orders that could, disorders that could occur. And so the main problem there is the diagnosis. And also, you've got astronauts who don't necessarily want to report on all the things that have gone wrong, because either they want to continue their flight, or they want to be able to fly again. So sometimes it's hard to have those kind of open dialogues. So that's also something that has to be very closely monitored. So I've been fortunate enough to be part of a whole bunch of Mars simulations. I've been on 5 of them at the Mars Desert Research Station, and 1 in the Arctic at FMARS, the Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station. I've got my simulated EVA stats at the bottom, just because that's kind of one of the areas that my research is focused in. So it's fun to think about those 232 hours or 84 EVAs. So that averages like 2 or 3 hours per EVA, and most of the longer EVAs on space station are more like 6 to 8 hours. And that's not necessarily a duration that we can endure if we're going to have a crew on the surface for more than a few weeks. So here's what the Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station looks like. That's mostly what we're going to be talking about in this short talk. This is when we arrived in May of 2007. So very icy cold. The temperatures were -40, pick your Fahrenheit or Celsius, same difference. This is where it's located. It's way up in the Arctic on Devon Island. It's right on Houghton Impact Crater, which is a 39-million-year-old crater. So the reason for having the station there is that this is analogous to an impact crater that you would be investigating at any other destination, because with an impact crater, you're actually unearthing, in this case, the layers and history of the planetary formation, possibly the solar system formation, as well as searching for the kind of ancient microbial activity. So this is a lot of text here, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of the crew is a crew of 7. We were there for 4 months. We actually had 100 operating days, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. we had a 20-minute communication delay, meaning if we wanted to talk to mission support, family, anyone, we would have to kind of wait to hit send on our emails to maintain this. And nowadays we have simulations that actually have built-in computer software to help them with that delay. So it's definitely a test in, I guess, perseverance of maintaining a simulation as well. It's not the easiest thing to do. It was very remote. It's isolated. It's the largest uninhabited island on Earth. Visible life is rare. We saw like one bird fly overhead in 4 months in lichen on the rock, and that was almost it. We did see some researchers come in for the month of July from NASA and the Canadian Space Agency, but they were about a mile or kilometer-ish away. So they were like little teeny dots in the horizon. So that wasn't really too much of an effect on us. The harsh temperatures I already mentioned. So confined, I mentioned that you had to wear a spacesuit anytime you leave these habitats. And it actually was 24 hours of sunlight. So it's very analogous to a polar mission for both Moon and Mars. So this is one of the first EVAs. So the question is like, is this a Mars analog? It looks more like a Moon analog. And I guess we should have capitalized more on the fact that, yeah, this is very lunar-like, and maybe we should see what other investigations we can come up with during the time. But just like all things that are expected, eventually all of that melted away, and so we're left with our rocky landscape on the rim of the crater. So it's very Mars-like and analogous too. So here's my like hero shot. We actually had a photographer that came up at the very end. So I'm on the rim of the crater, and then you can't really tell, but it dives down really sharp there with the large boulders and into the fields. So some countermeasures. So that's mostly what we're talking about today is the countermeasures, like how do you deal with long duration missions? Maybe it relates to some of the things you're going through right now. But the first part is selection. So obviously we weren't really, I guess you could say your selection was like, you know, for those that are married or have kids and things like that, that's part of your selection and choices that you make. So you can kind of filter selecting out, meaning like for the astronaut selection that just closed last night at midnight, you had to have a master's degree or higher. So if you only had a bachelor's, they would select you out of the process. Selecting in is kind of like, you know, picking people that are the specific disciplines that you need. Okay, we know we need to have a field geologist with an expertise in polygons. And so you would find that specific person or persons and be able to bring them in. Self-select is kind of like, you know, if the astronauts are working together and they find that, hey, I really work well with so-and-so, and this happens in the office place as well, and we'd like to take on other projects or challenges together, then that's a good way of testing these things. Field testing, meaning like going on analogs just like this one to see how they do. Under pressure, isolated in these different environments. And then just kind of other things to think about are the culture, gender, and all the other things that make us unique. So this is an eyesore, but it's a story, I guess you could say. So this is a table of kind of the recommended things, I guess you could say, for finding the ideal candidates. This is from Jay Bucky's book, Space Physiology, which is an excellent book that talks about this. And so the traits that our crew in the Arctic really enjoyed were the sense of humor and the ability to be easily entertained. Not sure who that pirate is in the corner. You might recognize them now. But we really were feeling like we were connected to a lot of cultural references at the time. Specifically, one of our crew members, Kim Binstead, introduced us to Lost. I think we watched the first 3 seasons of Lost while we were up there. And we really kind of joked and connected with like, hey, yeah, we're like the people on the island, and we're not sure with some of these experiments, and we have to push the button every day to check in with the polar Arctic shelf team to make sure that our project was safe and things like that. So we had a lot of parallels with that show, so it's kind of fun. This is from last selection from 2017 for the astronaut selection for NASA. And so there's a lot of the traits that overlap here, not too intense, personal, self-starter, hard worker. So these are the type of things that you would expect in a selection process. So the main thing here I believe in as well is that training really is the key to making these things work well. I mean, that's obviously why we train crews before sending them anywhere. This is the training that we underwent before going to the Arctic. We actually spent 2 weeks at the Mars Desert Research Station. We had, I guess you could say, half of the time was working with the principal investigators of the different projects. We did 2 or 3 days of a wilderness training program. We had extra ATV training. We actually had firearms training because there are polar bears in the Arctic. And so, yeah, there's no polar bears on Mars, but this is one of the operational things that we kind of have to add in to make sure that we're safe. We had to have protocols on what do we do if we actually encounter a bear. And so there's a lot more to it. And it turns out the only bears we saw are in the photos on the right here. The bottom right is in the airport, and the top right is from the Resolute place where we were gearing up before going onto the island. So here's what it looked like when we arrived in Resolute. So we also had some Arctic training as well. This is specifically snowmobile training, how to make sure your fingers don't freeze off. It is really that cold. They have heat warmers that are in the handlebars. So without that, it would be almost impossible, even if you shielded your hand from the cold wind. So every now and then you actually have to stop and shake your arms out to get the blood flowing back to your fingertips. Got to meet amazing people up there in Resolute, and obviously that we had a lot of fun hanging out with the locals and the kids. I didn't have a photo here, but we actually had like a walk around where we just wanted to walk around and check things out. And it was just like slowly, kid by kid came running out. It was like a commercial, and they started following us around. So that was really cool. And then puppies, puppies are a countermeasure, of course, too. And so never neglect the fact that that's a major part of this as well. I guess, Cyan, if you want to launch the poll, now would probably be a good time. It's kind of hard for me to see any of the chat window stuff, unfortunately, when I'm talking, but I'll make sure we have time for lots of questions after. So keep those puppies in mind. You'll see another photo of them later. So some of the countermeasures, sleep is important, obviously, and we actually had a study that looked at our sleep cycle. This shirt was looking at respiratory rate, heart rate, and we actually had a sleep log diary that we would fill in before going to bed and then after going to bed. So it's kind of interesting to be part of that. Exercise is a big part of it. And then medications is more on the general spaceflight side of things. We weren't really medicated in any way, so don't worry. But there is medications like anything else in moderation. So conflict resolution training, so this is important for people to know about for if they want to be able to do these kind of things, is knowing about hot buttons. So if a family issue came up and just because we were talking about puppies before and something bad happened to your puppy and that's a hot button for you, if anyone talks about your puppy, you get really upset, then that's something that you should know about, and it might be something you share with your team. Meeting yourself, that's kind of like when you're extremely stressed and you kind of get to a point like, oh, this is me, like I get this. I know that I can kind of move on. I kind of went through this a little bit after 2 months up there. For me, it was kind of like, wow, this has been really interesting, and this has been a very stressful point. But in a way, it's kind of like an academic semester. Like I'm here for 4 months, or it's like an internship, and there's 2 more months to go, and I'm gonna just like really enjoy my time here. So that really turned things 180 when I kind of had that self-reflection on this. And Erin had talked about reflection in her talk last week as well. So simulations are important, as you know. Psychological support, care packages. We did have supplies occasionally flown in because we needed to have more fuel and things like that added for generator and other things flown out. And we actually had snowmobiles for the first month or so and then switched to ATVs. So those are important. Celebrations, we actually had things like Talk Like a Pirate Day and whatever you can think of on the calendar for the entire 4 months, just so we could have other things that we could kind of rally around if we weren't being creative at that specific point. In the photo there, you can see that we were actually celebrating. We watched one of the hockey games. That's actually the only hockey game that the Ottawa Senators won in that Stanley Cup that year. And we didn't get to see the rest of the series, which is probably good because it didn't go so well for them. Was there a question? I heard some audio pop up.
People can you see the poll? I'm just putting it out there. I know somebody has voted.
Okay.
Because they're asking where is the question, and I'm not quite sure
Okay.
because I'm administering it. I don't know where you can see the question.
Oh, okay. I don't know either. It's the first time we're playing with polls, but if you look at your kind of hot menu bar, it might be in there where you'll see like a poll pop up, or it might be in the manage participants. So I guess the person who answered the poll, if you could put something in the chat room for everyone else, that would be awesome.
It looks like it's a pop-up, so it might have popped up
Okay.
behind their screen. So if they minimize their
Okay.
screen, you might be able to see it.
Cool. Yeah, we can come back to it in the Q&A as well, because my full screen sharing here takes away some of the other features, unfortunately. Okay, so training. So just some insights of what it looked like. Here's the commander's room on the left, so tight quarters. On the right is our all-inclusive resort, meaning it was the all-in-one upper level wardroom, dining, social. We'd move those tables out of the way, put some pillows on the floor, and like watch Lost on a laptop. And so exploration in itself is the countermeasure. So getting to go on these EVAs, getting to see these one-of-a-kind places, seeing them for the first time, the second time, the fifth time, it didn't really matter. Each of them was exhilarating, and so just EVAs itself was really important for getting to counteract any of the stresses. So here's a shot of us suiting up, getting ready for our simulated EVA. Some more photos. Physical challenges are actually pretty rewarding as well, because it's just like exercise, get the endorphins pumping and everything else. The photos here, you can see us holding a drill. That was one of our main tools. This was actually where we were chasing the permafrost. The permafrost is the layer that slowly moves away as the ground warms up from the summer. And so that's most likely place you'll find microbial life with the water content. So also for geological sampling of the rock layers and of the history. So on the left there was kind of what it looked like when it was cold. But on the right, where you can see the big hole, we actually had to dig a meter deep. It was extremely difficult, really hard to do even in simulated spacesuits. And it's kind of like digging your own grave. And it's, this is the type of hardships that a crew's got to be ready for. Eventually you have to say goodbye to all these different cool, unique locations. And this was actually a photo from, we experienced kind of our first sunset near the end of the mission. Like I mentioned, it was 24 hours of sun while we were up there. And then coming home to the little things, question mark, as you can see here, those puppies aren't so small anymore after 4 months, but they're still friendly and adorable. And then there's Toronto. That's my home town. Now, real quickly, just a couple extra photos before we can get to Q&A. Mars Desert Research Station's located in Utah. Utah is Mars. It's very red, iron-like, ancient lake bed. A lot of parallels to the type of investigations that you would do on the red planet. One of my favorite spots is visiting Phobos Peak. It's a bit of a hike to get up there, and it's really hard to see, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. But right now I'm scrolling over the far right center on screen. There's about 4 white dots. That's actually the habitat in the science dome in the background. So really cool view from up top. Another countermeasure is like personal goals. So in this case, I was actually conducting a handful of research projects with my lab. And so this one was on spacesuit range of motion. And so, getting to do those projects and completing them is important as well. So the unreal landscapes that you get to experience is a big part of it. Again, these are really cool features that are found in the desert. And then finally, family, being connected to family is really important, and a way of, keeping up with what's happening back home. So I brought Lightning McQueen to Mars for my son, and took some fun photos in the field and was able to share that. And I had gift packages, like a letter that I got to open every day, and actually had a puzzle piece of a Lightning McQueen puzzle. And so I got to slowly put that together during the mission. And then finally, sparking joy. So that's happening a lot right now. These are photos from this week. So kids are busy doing lots of creative things. I'm drawing the dog on every surface possible. So that was with chalk. That's my dog, Teddy. And then, just even applying to be an astronaut with the closing last night, those things were a nice kind of, it's not really a side project, that's kind of a lifelong project, but just getting to do those things that, really bring you joy are really important. And then everything is Minecraft. I just had to throw that in there because that's really what I'm experiencing in my current confined, isolated location. I'm learning a lot about Minecraft though, and it's pretty cool. So next week, our preview is with Dr. Cyan Proctor. She'll be talking about space to inspire, a new way to think about space. So we're looking forward to that. Same bat time, same bat channel. So noon Eastern time, and we'll be sending out that link over the next week or so before obviously the talk. And with that, I'm going to close out and take questions. So thank you. I'll try to keep my screen sharing open, but I definitely want to get to the tile view of all our guests. And I see Raffi's making faces in the background of my wife's camera, Jen's camera. Let's see, how can I split up the view a little bit here? I'm going to stop the sharing and go back to this view. Let's go back to the family view part. All right, so was there, how did the poll go, co-host? Did that pop up properly or at all?
No, it didn't.
Okay.
Only one person was able to see it. So
Oh.
not quite sure why that is.
Oh, well, that's okay. It was just experimental. That's, you know, training. We need more training. I did.
The question though, so
Yeah,
that people know what it was.
the question was, would you be willing to go on a Mars simulation mission? And if yes, how long would you go for? And my multiple choice answer was no, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, and then 500 days as the options.
So you can write your
yeah.
answer in the chat if you would like.
Yeah, definitely do that. And we'll see the chat transcript as well. So if we miss questions, we can always come back to them as well. So that's always fun to do. Were there questions that popped up? Sorry, I had trouble kind of viewing the all three screens kind of thing at once. So I was just looking at just the slides to make sure I didn't miss any content.
Jen wrote, Raffi asks if you missed him when you were on Mars.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course I missed Raffi. I missed Jen and Raffi and Teddy and everyone else. But he got to be part of that mission too a little bit with, you know, getting to be my support team. So he was my mission support. So he was there too. And I had photos up, and so it was like, you know, you're the same way you would set up your office or whatever, you have your family and friends kind of surrounding you in some aspect.
Ryan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What were the big crew conflicts, if any, that you saw arising in any of your missions that you experienced?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say, I'm going to summarize it in a different way, so it's not like too specific, but I'll try to give a little examples off of each. But communication is usually what would lead to some of the conflicts. There were some, they weren't necessarily like us versus them, but it was more like a communication of not fully understanding what some of the scientific investigations were from mission control or mission support in this case, because you actually have a mission support when you're doing a Mars simulation, because they're trying to direct an input and give feedback versus creating the full schedule. So a crew on the surface of Mars that's going to have these time delays are really going to have some level of autonomy and be able to function without having kind of the nonstop second by second play by play. And so that was communication in general is definitely part of that. Between team members, I've been very fortunate. I've had some very strong crews that I've worked with, and the conflicts have been addressed, I guess you can say, as they happen. They're like, hey, you know, I'm not too comfortable with that type of language about that topic, kind of that. Again, I'm being very generic to be protective of my crew posse, but those are the kind of things that would tend to come up. And you just have to be open. It's open communications. You got to be able to address the problem, try to work through it, and make sure that everyone's on the same page. And if you're not, then you need to find an alternative solution and possibly bring in mediation, someone to kind of be in the middle, sit there, listen to the opinions, and kind of help the whole group out, if you will. And so that's also something that's very viable in the future, is that if a crew has a major implosive problem, that they would actually get together, bring in a third party, and have them run the session. There's a question here from one of my students I just saw pop up from Dan O'Brien. Did it feel weird to walk around in a spacesuit in a place that looks like a foreign planet? So the answer is yes and no. So it wasn't weird, but it definitely felt like we were in a very foreign place. The terrain at both locations, both the Arctic and in Utah, are very Mars-like, and so the realism of what's surrounding you amplifies the actual simulation. So even if you happen to feel like a cool breeze come in the bottom of your bubble helmet, and like it's, oh, I just felt the outside for the first time in a month, those things wouldn't really take away from the fact that you are really engaged in doing the simulation. Another major part of that is that the work that was conducted at these locations was actually real scientific investigations that were being done by people not wearing spacesuits. So that's why the Canadian Space Agency, NASA, other people were actually up on Devon Island, and they try to go every summer, is that the work that they do up there was actually, we were doing the same work with the same principal investigator team, just like, some overlap between what they were working with, but doing it with the hardship of the simulation itself. And I just want to add in one last little point. The polar bear monitor was actually wearing as much gear as the simulated astronauts. Their backpack was filled with safety gear. They were carrying around the shotgun. Most of the time it was cold, so they were wearing ski goggles, full tube, neck warmer, like all the way bundled up. And so they were wearing just almost as much equipment as the simulated astronauts. There's some more questions here. I'm wondering if, I don't mind staying longer, obviously, to answer questions, but obviously there might be people who might need to drop off, so I don't want to make you feel like you need to be here, but you're welcome to hang out, and I'll hang out longer, and I'll keep recording so we do some more Q&A. So I guess I'll go to my co-host to see if there's any questions that were earlier that I missed that maybe I should get to.
No, I think we got them all. We're caught up, and it looks like Jessica's question is the next one.
Okay, perfect. Yep. So Jessica asks, how did you get involved in Sims? What experiences would you say best prepare you for your first simulation mission? So great question, and also hello to Jesse's students, Ethan Holden from Layton High School in Dalton, Nebraska. So my first simulation was with the Penn State Mars Society, and I had previously heard about the Mars Desert Research Station through my colleagues at the International Space University, because we were trying to put together a mission, and I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing. I want to try that or do that. And just with our one-year masters, it just wasn't in the cards. So when I got to Penn State and I started working with their Mars Society, which is essentially not just a club, but a club that does everything from technical projects. They were actually building a rover to advocacy on the Hill. And so I got connected with them early. We're very like-minded people. We all love space. And they started talking about bringing their rover to the desert to test it. And I'm like, can I be part of the team? And I'm like, you can give me whatever role you want. I'm all for it. Let's do it. So I think I was like the health and safety officer on my first mission. And so there isn't a super specific strong requirement. You can start pretty early on these simulations if you want to. It's a little bit of pay to play, meaning that like you put together your team and a proposal, you send it to the Mars Society, and you work with them to figure out a possible time slot, like a 2-week slot for your team to go into. If you're by yourself and you still want to apply, you can still apply as an individual, and they can try to match you with a team. So a lot of these places actually have a way of getting in the door to get these experiences, and then they kind of build up. So with the Canadian Mars Society, we were actually creating a program called Expedition, not Expedition, see, it's been so long that I don't remember. I think it was Expedition Mars. And we were actually creating a training program where we would have instructors go with a new crew of 6, like 2 instructors, and train them on all the different protocols for taking samples, the different field biology, geology type of experiments. And then from that program, we actually created kind of a close friendship between a bunch of us. And so when the call came out for an Arctic mission, there was 5 of us that actually put a proposal together to be on the crew. 4 out of 5 of us were able to do it because we were selected. And so the 4 of us moved forward. And then they were like, we really need to fill in, the missing team members of those key roles. And that's how the full team got formed. So it's kind of cool and exciting experience. And so that 2 weeks of training, there were a bunch of us that didn't know each other going into the 2 weeks of training before the 4 months. And so none of us admitted this at the time, but we all admitted it after, because we became friends in those 2 weeks, was that we were looking at those 2 weeks, like going into them, like, if things don't go well here, I don't know if I'm going to actually, say yes to the 4 months in the Arctic. And so we all kind of mentioned that to each other by the end of the 2 weeks, and they're all like, me too, I was thinking that too. And so we became very comfortable. We had this giant Excel sheet of all the different protocols for what do we do if something goes wrong, polar bear injury, other things, lots of things can go wrong. So we had ways of dealing with them. So Cyan put a comment here about high seas. So from our crew, Kim Binstead was our chief scientist on the crew. And during the time, she actually came up with a very interesting study about how food affects us in isolation and in these environments. And that actually led on to the creation of High Seas, which is in Hawaii, which you'll see in Cyan's little picture right there if you see her video camera. And she's going to be talking more about High Seas as part of her talk next week, right? Yeah. Well, it'll be part of your talk? Yep. And so they've had a range of different mission simulations there as well. And so the kind of the history of High Seas actually came out of this particular Arctic mission. So it's pretty cool work. And High Seas, located on a volcano, lots of volcanoes on the moon and Mars. So that's where the kind of parallel is, exploring lava tubes, lots of cool things there. And it's, when you think about it, when you're exploring a volcano, you're exploring the newest Earth that's been formed. So it's like not only understanding our history of the solar system and the formation of the solar system, but now looking at how things are actually formed. So we get the full age spectrum, if you will. And the great question from Elizabeth, have the 3 of you done a mission together? So not yet is the best answer. So Aaron, Cyan, and myself are the Flight Ready Systems company, if you will, the startup. And that's definitely on our to-do list. I've never been, they were just at High Seas as part of their all-female Sensoria crew in January. And excuse me, high on my target list is to be able to go to High Seas. I haven't actually visited or been part of a simulation there, but I also would love to go to Aquarius Reef Base. I'm a scuba diver, and it's a very good parallel too for if you're playing with center of gravity for preparing for the moon or Mars. And lots of my students that are online here can tell you all about that now, about their creating their simulated analog spacesuits as part of their projects. And so, yeah, I would love to, and I'd love to go to all these other locations. It just depends on where I am in life and all those other fun things.
Let's make the reef base the next one.
Sure, why not? Yeah, I'm good with that. And I'm sure they're good with that too. And I had mentioned them in the slides. The Nemo is NASA's project that visits them roughly every year, and they have about a 10-day to 2-week mission that they run underwater as a kind of full-up simulation involving astronauts. I don't know if they've had cosmonauts. They've definitely had astronauts from the Canadian Space Agency. And so they're actually, once you live underwater, I think it's for over 24 hours, you're considered an aquanaut. Because at that point, you've done a saturation dive and you can't just pop up to the surface. You actually have to go through a breathing protocol to safely come back up. Any other questions that, if I missed it, you can cut paste it real quick. Yeah, I see a message from Diego. He says, count me in. He's also at Embry-Riddle. He's our flight doc expert that we work with the suit lab. And I'm just scrolling real quick to see if I can catch anything else that I might have missed.
There was one question that just came in. Yeah. One of the students designing the suits that you just mentioned. Okay. For all 3 of us, what is one thing about the spacesuits that we would change?
About the current, I'm guessing they mean by the current simulated spacesuits or by the real spacesuits?
Nicole, you want to clarify that?
Probably for simulated spacesuits, because that's part of it as well. So yeah, with the main thing that I would change, let's see, would be the helmet, to make sure that it was a higher fidelity visor. The ones I used were, they're actually plastic fish bowls, literally, and they get abraded, they get scratched, and it gets difficult to see through them. Because of the materials, they fog up unless you've got a good airflow on them. And so a better fidelity, I think, visor system. And of course, I would love to have like a heads-up display or augmented reality as part of that, so I don't have to look at small gadgets, and making it easy to work with. And so I'll give a plug to my other students that are working on the NASA Suits Challenge for this exact kind of challenge with augmented reality and a Magic Leap. So Cyan and Aaron, oh, Cyan just popped away. So Aaron, what would you change specifically in the spacesuits? Oh, she went to get a prop, I think, for simulations.
Well, while Sai puts her helmet on, I would actually, there are two things. Waterproofing is important in an analog, because then you're not as limited to going outside when it's raining or damp. And communication system. So like being able to communicate with each other and have communications uninterrupted is quite a challenge. And I've heard this consistently across all the habitats out there, that seems to be the one thing that people are still trying to figure out. So if somebody wants to make a great comm system, please do. Sorry.
Yeah, what would you change?
Add on to that. I was wearing my spacesuit. One of the things that as a geoscientist, geologist, when we're at someplace like high seas, you can see that the terrain is very rugged. And so walking is a hazard. And one of the things is these helmets, depending on the design, can be really heavy, and this blocks you from being able to see your feet. And so you're always constantly, we called it helmet headache or a helmet, because you're always looking down to make sure you don't fall and hurt yourself. And so having a well-designed helmet where it really goes, that you can see all the way down and you're not obscured when you're walking, would be awesome.
Yeah, awesome points. And the current plan right now for the XEMU, which will be called the MEMU if it becomes a Mars suit, has the bubble helmet, as people have seen, so it's connected to the rest of the body. And so the idea is that you hopefully would have good range and good visibility. But also relating to comms, they want to go for an integrated speaker set versus having like the Snoopy cap on, because these things rub on your ears, on your head. They move around, like the hat part moves around, it gets hot. And so that's something they might be changing and removing. And so we'll see. We can have a whole other talk on spacesuit design as well. I did see a question about if Europeans could participate in these missions. Absolutely. The European Space Agency was just at high seas for 2 different missions, as well as a lot of European friends were actually just at the Mars Desert Research Station not too long ago in, I think it was February. I saw a message back here about the suit pressurization on simulation. I think that came from Cam Smith. So pressurized suits, absolutely, like as mentioned earlier, as many variables that you can match for simulation, the better the simulation can be. There are some unique ideas that a lot of people have presented. One thing I really like about the Austrian Space Forum's concept for their suit is that instead of creating a pressurized suit, they've actually created a suit exoskeleton that doesn't help you. It actually interferes and makes it feel like you're wearing a pressurized suit. So it actually restricts your arm motion, like your shoulder mobility, and makes it more like a realistic suit that way. And so that's a really interesting approach. And we can learn a lot about how that restricts comfort, mobility, and obviously the field science is number one. Because at the end of the day, like what really matters for all these missions is actually the data that we bring back. And what we can learn from the missions themselves. Other questions about living in sim? We should probably wrap up, but we can take maybe one more.
We'll do one more that came in from Martine.
Okay.
What did you do when in stress? And what did you miss regarding earthly simulations?
Okay. So for stress, there's a few different ways of answering that. So entertainment is kind of a big kind of catch-all. One of the first things I actually did when I got to the Arctic, as we were all kind of moving in and we had a little bit of personal time to move our stuff in, unpack a bit, I actually built a shelf in my room and I called it the Polar Shelf, which was kind of a pun on Polar Shelf was the company or the group that we actually checked in with every day to make sure we were safe. If you don't check in with Polar Shelf every day, I think after 2 times, then they come after you, they come rescue you. So anyway, I built my own Polar Shelf and it's to fit my laptop, and I brought speakers out, like little, not too big, but computer speakers, and I built a little movie theater in my room. Because I know that that's what I personally love to do, is watch things and unwind and relax. And I mean, the irony is that most of the time you actually are plugged in, because it's not really fair to other people that you're living with if you've got the noise up. And so really I was on a headset most of the time, but every now and then I would have the speakers on, and we could have a 2 or 3 people come in the room and just kind of hang out and watch something if we wanted to. So that's one of the things. The other thing was, it's very similar and related, but we had an exercise bike in the Arctic, and usually our exercise protocols were saying like roughly half hour on the bike. And so I would just watch an episode of something. I happened to bring, I think it was Son of the Beach or something, and it wasn't that good of a show, but it became kind of part of my routine. Like, so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna watch another episode while I'm on the bike. And it was entertaining. And the more isolated you get, the more entertaining these things actually seem. And when you have limited options for entertainment, then those things become pretty valuable as well. Like I mentioned, we were able to watch one hockey game, but that was after it was like extremely downloaded over like 2 nights. Bandwidth is definitely an issue that impacts communication as well. For video like sending videos back and forth is actually kind of difficult. But you're able to work through it and figure out like, okay, I'm going to download this 1-minute thing or this PDF of a file, and I'm going to walk away for a half hour and come back and assume that it will have been downloaded. And just so just kind of a add-in here, because I thought of it, one of the protocol add-ins for us for the internet was that we assumed that we would have the Google search index downloaded roughly every night, meaning you could type anything into Google, like in terms of a search, and it would show the results, but you weren't able to actually click the next link without a 20-minute delay. So you would have the index, and then if you needed the next document level or the next level of the website, you'd have to click, basically wait for that click. And if you needed a file, journal article, then you would do a request to mission support. And there's a lot of different ways of doing these protocols. The idea is that you create something that everyone agrees to, and that's what's going to maintain the simulation. So if somebody's busy chatting away, Snapchatting behind the scenes, then that will take away from the overall simulation for everyone, even if they don't know about it. All right, so let's wrap up. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you found this interesting, learned maybe a little something, and I hope to hear about all your analog adventures. And tune in next week when Cyan will inspire us all. So without further ado, I'd like to just say thanks again, and space.